Hello, and welcome back to the Law Academy podcast. This is episode 5, I believe, of the Law Academy podcast, and naively, I thought that we would be able to do a couple of episodes talking about Russia-Ukraine, talking about the situation, maybe a bit of the international law and some of the events that are going on, and then we'd be able to move on and talk about other things. But like I said, this was a very naive thought of mine because there's so many tangentially related issues that are issues of international law, issues of law more generally, that relate to this Russia-Ukraine situation. So I'm going to talk about in future episodes the legality of the recognition of the sovereign states, quote unquote, that exist in the region of Donbass, according to Russia. I'm going to be talking about other issues that relate to refugee law, as that relates to the humanitarian crisis that is going to be taking place and is currently taking place in Europe at the moment. This is something that is going to be a huge issue that really needs to be resolved very, very quickly. Then there are also others that I'm going to be talking about that are tangentially related to this area of the law. So talking about the occupation and annexation of Crimea within the realm of international law, that's something that can be touched on as a separate lesson. The concept of a number of other areas as well. Things such as the alleged genocide of, quote, Russian-speaking persons within the area of Ukraine. One of the main justifications that the Putin actually highlighted when it came to the protection of individuals in areas of Ukraine and the, quote-unquote, demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. These are issues that are so complicated that we need to talk about. So, ultimately, in this episode, we're going to talk about war crimes committed in Ukraine. We're going to just very briefly go back through the news and just see where we're at in terms of events that have taken place since the last episode, last week. And then we're going to talk about what war crimes actually are, because I think there's a little bit of misinterpretation about what actually constitutes a war crime in international humanitarian law. Something that we should really get a better understanding of if we're going to make claims of war crimes against particular parties involved in this conflict, and then talk about the actual claims that have been made and the allegations that have been made so far. And it should be noted that while there may be some evidence in a number of these cases when it comes to potential war crimes being committed in Ukraine, some of them may be just video evidence of things that would constitute a war crime. These are all still alleged war crimes, okay? Just like any crime, the prosecution of war crimes is something where we have to apply the rules of the rule of law and things such as the concept of innocent until proven guilty, and we need to make sure that we have valid evidence to make sure that these are actually war crimes being committed. So if I talk about war crimes, potential war crimes committed in Ukraine, it should be noted that these are quote-unquote alleged war crimes. That's what's important. So let's begin by talking about Ukraine in terms of the Russia-Ukraine situation, in terms of the news that's taken place. One of the interesting things that's happened is that Ukraine is possibly, quite likely in fact, at the time of recording, set to join the European Union. One of the reasons why Putin decided to invade Ukraine was the influence of Western institutions like NATO and the European Union in the Ukrainian region, and he tried to invade as an attempt to block and to ensure that he had this sphere of influence between and this buffer state between him and the Russian Federation and the institutions such as the European Union and NATO. In fact, that's done quite the opposite. So one of his arguments was he didn't want to see an expansion of NATO further east into other states. Interestingly, now both Sweden and Finland have expressed desire to join NATO, which I'm sure made Putin very, very happy. And also Ukraine has been continuing to make desires to join NATO for a very long time. The European Union now are set to probably accept Ukraine to join the European Union. President Zelensky to the European Parliament, I believe yesterday or the day before, which got him a standing ovation at the European Parliament. It was quite a moving speech. So ultimately, all of the reasons why Putin wanted to invade Ukraine, to create this buffer state, to destabilize the West, and to cause conflict, and to make sure that Ukraine was not going to join these institutions, he seems to have done the exact opposite in these things. So that at least makes me happy that is going on. There are also peace talks going on. There have been peace talks going on for a couple of days now between Russia and Ukraine. I'm not sure if they're actually going to go anywhere in terms of demands being met, because ultimately I'm sure Russia's demands would at the very least be not membership to things like the European Union and NATO, and also the formal recognition of the states that have been so-called recognized by the Russian, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine. They're probably not recommendations, or they're probably not requirements that Ukraine are going to fulfill. Ukraine will probably just want to see a full withdrawal of Russian forces from their borders and their territories. They've not capitulated on the Donetsk and Luhansk region of Ukraine ever since these claims were being made years ago. So there's not really any reason to suggest that they would now. Maybe the invasion has changed things slightly, but who knows? So probably these peace talks might not work, but we'd have to keep an eye on those. According to Ukrainian authorities, more than 2,000 civilians have been killed. This is something that we're going to touch on later on, because it obviously ties into the question of war crimes being committed. Now, it should be noted that just because a civilian dies in war doesn't necessarily mean that a war crime has been committed. No war ever necessarily you would never expect no civilians to die within any kind of war where civilians are populated. So that's something that we'll talk about as we carry on in this episode. There have been intense fighting in the south of the country, with key Ukrainian cities like Kharkiv and Kherson being targeted by Russian artillery. According to the Russian state, they have, as of about 30 minutes ago, made the claim that they have captured the city of Kherson, which is yet to be, I'm yet to confirm, but at the time of recording, that is the allegation that's being made, and they've claimed that 0 civilians were killed in the capturing of Kherson, which I probably don't believe. A number of other things that we should relate to and talk about in terms of the news. Around 700,000 people have fled Ukraine already in a refugee crisis that will be getting worse as this size. The United Nations has called for more supplies, and we will obviously do a lesson or an episode of the Law Academy podcast on refugee law in the future, because that's a really interesting area of the law that ultimately really should be devoid of any kind of political intervention, but we will see how that goes. And now for the topic of what we're actually going to talk about in this episode, which is the fact that we have seen reports of potential war crimes being committed during this podcast. And ultimately, we have to think about what a war crime is before we try and relate that understanding to this situation in Russia and Ukraine, to try and find out whether or not, or at least come to a better determination that if we have made claims about potential war crimes, that we're actually being accurate in making these claims. And now this is not going to get too heavy in terms of the law, because I feel like the last episode was quite law heavy, and I know some people want to see more and more law and lots of sources and lots of references and citations to the law, but I also want to make this quite accessible to other people as well, people who aren't massively into the law or even studying law at all, that are just interested in understanding a little bit better these quite complicated topics. So I'm going to try and keep it relatively light in terms of the legal things that are being said. But we do have to obviously make reference to a number of issues. So the first question is that, what is a war crime? Well, ultimately, it's a thing that is necessarily going to happen, because if there is a law of war, if there is humanitarian law, the law as it relates to the regulation and things that happen on the battlefield, then violations of that law are not just possible, but they're inevitable. Okay, and it stands to reason that there may be what we would describe as a hierarchy of war crimes. There could be war crimes that are not necessarily as bad as other war crimes. I think this is something that most people would understand to be the case. But what constitutes a war crime in the first place? Well, the first step to finding out what a war crime is to note that that an armed conflict must take place. So we have to reference or solidify the concept of a war crime within the context of an armed conflict. That's the first step. So for something to be a war crime, it must be committed during an armed conflict. And so the first question really, ultimately, will be, what is an armed conflict? Now, an armed conflict can exist as either international in nature or non-international in nature. The vast majority of armed conflicts today are actually non-international armed conflicts. They're conflicts that take place within the borders of a single state, maybe civil wars or wars between different non-state armed groups, etc., etc. Interestingly, though, the Russia-Ukraine situation is an example of an international armed conflict, which is a very rare situation that we find ourselves in today's world, especially a European international armed conflict, one that is... Something like this has not happened at this scale since the Second World War. But ultimately, an armed conflict, either international or non-international, is a prerequisite for the existence of war crimes. Now, how do we determine if an armed conflict exists? Well, there are lots of different ways, and it's not a clear-cut kind of operation to try and work out whether an armed conflict exists. It tends to be done on a case-by-case basis, but there are some decisions that have been made that do give us a general basic guideline as to what an armed conflict is, or when an armed conflict occurs. And we can use a provision that is set out and a test that is applied in the case of Tadic, which was a very early case at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So the former Yugoslavia broke up, war into separate states. We had the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. There were a number of different things, horrific things taking place. War crimes were committed, genocide was committed, crimes against humanity was committed, and the United Nations Security Council, in response, established an ad hoc criminal tribunal, the ICTY, to try individuals who had committed these crimes. And Tadic was one of the first cases to be heard at the ICTY. So it makes sense that Tadic made a number of different provisions within the law and established a number of principles of the law. And it says in the Tadic decision that, quote, an armed conflict exists whenever there is a resort to armed force between states or protracted armed violence between governmental authorities and organised armed groups within a state. This first quote covers both the international and non-international armed conflict reference. So the first bit is armed force between states. That's the international armed conflict. That's something that is happening in Russia and Ukraine. And then we also have the non-international armed conflict, the civil war kind of conflicts that we have. So things like protracted armed violence between governmental authorities and organised armed groups within a state. So that's what the first part of the Tadic decision says. And continuing on, they say that international humanitarian law continues to apply to the territory of the warring states, or, in the case of internal conflicts, the whole territory under the control of a party, whether or not actual combat has taken place there. So the first part of the decision tells us where the line is for determining whether or not an armed conflict exists. So it says when there has to be a resort to armed force between states. It's very easy to determine whether or not an armed conflict exists in an international case, like the case that we have here between Russia and Ukraine, because it's just a situation where we have armed force being used between two states, like Russia versus Ukraine in this situation. It's a little bit less easy to work out whether or not it exists in the case of a non-international armed conflict, because it's a little bit more tricky, because we have things like riots and protests and violence that takes place in things like that, that could... Where do we draw the line between that and armed conflict? So, for example, were the Troubles in Britain in the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, were they constituting a non-international armed conflict? Some people would argue yes, but other people would argue no. So just a food for thought there, really, when it comes to making a determination. But ultimately, we have what what is the rule for an armed conflict? So if we know an armed conflict exists, then we can now start to apply the rules of the rules of war to this armed conflict. And in the case of an armed conflict, there are lots of different ways in which we can violate different rules that exist. So we can have violations of simple domestic codes, like if you just commit a crime or break one of the military codes of your particular country. But then there are also violations of international humanitarian law, and then there are what we call grave breaches of international humanitarian law. Now, this final category, grave breaches of international humanitarian law, these are the kind of war crimes that we think about when we think of war crimes. If you see on the news a headline that talks about potential war crimes being committed, we're thinking of these grave violations of international humanitarian law. Now, this is not to say that the other category, just the on their own violations of international humanitarian law, that they are in any way less serious. In some cases, they are less serious, but they still constitute war crimes. And this is why I wanted to get early on mention the fact that we can have different categories and different hierarchies of war crimes. A simple violation of international humanitarian law could relate very simple to a mistake made in relation to badges or emblems within an armed conflict. This would be in violation of additional Protocol 3 of the Geneva Conventions. This is not normally what is referred to as a war crime, even though it technically is one. When we're talking about a war crime, we're often talking about the execution of prisoners of war, the indiscriminate killing of civilians, etc., torture, even like things such as genocide technically would, if committed in the context of an armed conflict, would constitute a war crime. Now, breaches of international humanitarian law, grave breaches of humanitarian law, are outlined in the Geneva Conventions, so Geneva Conventions 1 to 4, and also the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, specifically additional protocol 1, because additional protocol 2 effectively applies very similar rules but to non-international armed conflicts. So in the context that we're talking about, in the context that we're referring to here between Russia and Ukraine, the situation we're going to be referring to are the Geneva Conventions and additional Protocol 1 in terms of violations of international humanitarian law, because these are the provisions that focus on the international armed conflicts. Now, crimes such as genocide, crimes against humanity, or the crime of aggression are crimes that are under international criminal law, and they are not listed under international humanitarian law. So while it is technically the case that if a genocide, for example, was to be carried out under the remit of an armed conflict, this would technically, or could technically, constitute a breach of international humanitarian law by way of the killing of a particular protected group. These are not what we're generally talking about when we're talking about war crimes. These are crimes in and of themselves. Back to aggression in a minute, because it's important to talk about the distinction between the crime of aggression, the crime of a head of state or a person in a particular authority engaging in an aggressive and illegal armed conflict, that is different in many, many ways to the concept of a war crime. So when people call Putin a war criminal, they're not necessarily being 100% accurate in that regard. Now, let's define war crimes in a little bit more detail. And there are lots of different ways we can define war crime. I'm going to give you 4 different examples of the definitions of war crimes. So the first one is the United Nations War Crimes Commission, and they define a war crime as, quote, a serious violation of the laws or customs of war which entails individual criminal responsibility under international law. The second one, the 1956 US Field Manual, Law of Land Warfare, defines a war crime as the, quote, technical expression for a violation of the law of war by any person or persons, military or civilian. The London Charter, which is the legal document which established the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal, which was the tribunal that tried Nazis following the end of the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials. They defined a war crime in a little bit more length as, quote, violations of the laws or customs of war. Such violations include, but are not limited to, murder, ill treatment or deportation to slave labour or any other purpose of a civilian population or in occupied territory, murder or ill treatment of POWs, prisoners of war, or persons on the seas, killing of hostages, plunder of public or private property, wanton destruction of cities, towns, or devastation not justified by military necessity. Now, it should be noted that these two definitions are, these three definitions that I've just listed for you are old definitions. So the War Crimes Commission was quite a long time ago, the 1956 Field Manual was quite a long time ago, and the London Charter was even longer ago. But these, while they are quite old definitions of war crimes, they inform what we would constitute to be a war crime today. And the instruments that are in place today draw from these kinds of definitions and draw from serious principles that are found in these definitions. And that's why it's important that we note these definitions as well as the more modern ones. And speaking of the more modern ones, let's talk about the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The Rome Statute establishes the International Criminal Court, it establishes its jurisdiction, it establishes the rules, and it establishes the crimes within jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And in Article 8, it divides a war crime into four main categories. So we have grave breaches, which is Category 1. Category 2 include other serious violations of the laws and customs applicable in international armed conflict. So serious violations of the of IHL, International Humanitarian Law. The third category is serious violations of Article 3 common to the four Geneva Conventions. Now, what this is referring to is what we call Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, which is the part of the Geneva Conventions that applies to non-international armed conflicts. So before we had Additional Protocol 1 and Additional Protocol 2, we just had the four Geneva Conventions. And Common Article 3 was the only provision within international humanitarian law that specifically referred to non-international armed conflicts. It's not a reference we need to worry about in this conflict. And then finally, the fourth of the categories are other serious violations of the laws, customs applicable in armed conflicts, not of an international character. So again, applying to an armed conflict that isn't what we would describe in this particular example of Russia and Ukraine. The International Committee for the Red Cross study on customary law simply says that serious violations of international humanitarian law constitute war crimes. Simple as that. So while all these definitions are different, they do have common themes. One of the clear things that obviously would constitute a war crime is the quote-unquote serious violations of international humanitarian law. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about grave breaches of international humanitarian law. Now, the United Nations War Crimes Commission, also adds another aspect that is very important. They say that it entails individual criminal responsibility under international law. That's what's very important. If you're somebody who has command responsibility, who is a military commander, for example, and you commit a war crime, it's not just Russia or the Russian Federation or the Russian military that has committed a war crime. It is you who has committed a war crime. Individuals on the ground, as they could go from a private all the way up to a general. These people all have the ability to be tried individually under individual criminal responsibility for war crimes. If somebody who has only been in the military for 2 weeks and has been told to go off and fight in Ukraine, like some of these people have, and they commit a war crime, they maybe kill a civilian indiscriminately, they torture a civilian, or they torture a POW, okay, they will be liable for war crimes under the definition of international law. Now, ultimately, despite the fact that we've seen very broad definitions, okay, and all of these broad definitions tend to have common themes, in the past, cases and courts have gotten things wrong. they've gotten things wrong when it comes to what constitutes a war crime. And one example of this is the 2008, when we saw the Italian Court of Cassation, in an unreported case, they initiated criminal proceedings against an American soldier over a 2005 incident at a Baghdad checkpoint. Now, what happened in this instance was that the American soldier had fired on a speeding approaching vehicle, and they had killed a senior Italian intelligence officer in the process. And what had happened was they were charged under Italian law for voluntary murder and voluntary attempted murder, and ultimately the process of the case isn't necessarily important for what we're talking about. What is important, though, is that the courts described war crimes as, quote, odious and inhumane acts. Now, the concept of a war crime being an odious and inhumane act is an error. Not all war crimes are odious or inhumane acts. For example, the misuse of the emblem of the International Committee for the Red Cross and Red Crescent, the ICRC, the misuse of that emblem would constitute a war crime, but it would not necessarily be odious or inhumane. So we can see that despite the fact that we have lots of different definitions, and despite the fact that in the news at the moment, the concept of war crimes is something that is very, very important. It's on everybody's lips, the concept of what a war crime is, and whether or not Russia and Ukraine, either side of the fight, are possibly committing war crimes. Courts still get it wrong every now and then, and this is a very good example in 2008 of what constitutes a war crime, and courts not actually understanding a number of different aspects of it. The final thing that I want to talk about before we talk about Russia-Ukraine in more detail is the fact that war crimes are not subject to what we call a statute of limitations. So there is no fixed period of time where you cannot therefore be charged for a war crime. If you committed a war crime 100 years ago and you somehow managed to live to 120 and you are still alive, you can still be charged for that very same war crime. There's no statute of limitations. According to Deinstein, they say that once a war crime, always a war crime. Simple as that. So, when we're talking about the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and now we know a bit more about what a war crime actually is, it's important that we talk about the cases again by referring to them as alleged war crimes. We don't know. Information that has been coming out has been fake information. A lot of the information has been doctored information. There are some credible sources that would possibly constitute a war crime, but we wouldn't know until we investigate in a lot more detail. So it's important that we take everything with a pinch of salt, but then also remain quite studious in our investigations to make sure, so that we know what we're talking about effectively. And hopefully this podcast episode has allowed more people to know in a bit more detail what they're talking about when they are referring to things being a quote-unquote war crime. And with it being nearly a week since the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation, we are seeing the increased reports of war crimes committed. It first should be noted that, as I mentioned earlier on, the invasion itself is not a war crime. The invasion itself isn't necessarily a war crime. As stated above, an act of aggression is an issue that relates to international criminal law, and it is not a grave violation of international humanitarian law. The war might be illegal, and we're waiting on the International Court of Justice to make that determination. Personally, from the perspective of somebody who, likes to think that he knows a lot about international law, this is an illegal act of war. This would be an illegal conflict, but we'll wait and see what happens. But ultimately, it's not necessarily a violation of international humanitarian law. So let's talk about the actual violations that have been claimed. So according to Elliot Higgins, who is the founder of the investigative journalism site Bellingcat, they have said that there is evidence of Russia causing, quote, civilian harm. Okay. Now, again, it should be noted that we should take this with a pinch of salt. Straight away, initially take it with a pinch of salt, because any instance of a civilian being injured and killed is not necessarily a war crime. We have to focus on specific nuance here. If there are perfectly legal reasons to attack a target, so let's think about targeting decisions for a second. If there are perfectly reasonable and legal legitimate expectations to attack a particular target, And it just so happens that a civilian was very, very unlucky in that they were caught up in the crossfire and they ended up being killed or injured in this case. That would not necessarily be a war crime. So we need to be able to distinguish here. Unfortunately, international humanitarian law does not assume that it's going to protect every single civilian in an armed conflict. In fact, the purpose of international humanitarian law is to reduce the suffering in armed conflict as much as possible, but it recognizes that war is hell, and so therefore we're going to see some quite horrendous things take place. More egregious examples is the possible use of cluster bombs. Now, what's important to note is the legality of cluster bombs in international law. Cluster bombs, by the way, are bombs that are effectively scatter across a very large area of the ground, and so can cause quite widespread damage and are not very precise necessarily in their targeting. Under international law, the legality of cluster bombs is a little bit controversial because there is treaties that ban cluster bombs. On cluster munitions is an international treaty that prohibits all use, transfer, production and stockpiling of cluster bombs. It entered into force in 2010 and 110 states have ratified. The problem is, under international law, apply to the state parties to the treaty, to the states that are that have ratified the treaty. And unfortunately, Russia hasn't ratified the Convention on Cluster Munitions. So that's where there's a little bit of a bit of an issue in relation to the controversy of cluster munitions within international law. But what is important is that whether or not they have signed up and ratified the Cluster Munitions Treaty is irrelevant if they use these cluster munitions against civilians, because that would just be a normal violation of international humanitarian law, regardless of what the kind of weapons that are being used. So ultimately, as has been accused by Ukraine and by others who are involved in documenting and reporting on the issues, cluster bombs have allegedly been used against civilian populations, or at least into civilian areas in cities such as Kharkiv. Now, ultimately, the attention seems to be, at the moment, on attacks on the city of Kharkiv. This is a city that has held out significantly since the invasion began last week, and there have been multiple examples of attacks on that city, bombs going off and civilians dying and being killed in that city. As I've already mentioned, Ukraine have made the claim that 2,000 civilians have died in this conflict so far. So the issue of indiscriminate and the attacking and targeting of civilian areas is something that would be a violation of international humanitarian law, because we have to talk about the issue that relate to targeting, the law that relates to targeting. What do we mean by targeting? Effectively, when we are making a decision on what things we should be targeting in a bombing strike or a missile strike or an artillery strike, anything like that. So, ultimately, targeting decisions in international humanitarian law are codified in Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. And there are a few rules that exist. And these are the rules that are really, really important, because as wars have become more developed over the years, they've become less about the hand-to-hand combat, the one soldier versus another soldier combat happening in the world, and it's still happening in Russia-Ukraine. But the conflicts, modern conflicts today, focus more on long-range strikes on particular targets. So long-range missile strikes or bombing strikes or artillery strikes. That's what it tends to be. And so therefore targeting rules relating to what can and what cannot be targeted, are of the utmost importance, especially in this conflict. So Article 52.2 of Additional Protocol 1 says, and I quote, "Attacks shall be limited strictly to military objectives. Insofar as objects are concerned, military objectives are limited to those objects which, by their nature, location, purpose, or use, make an effective contribution to military action, and whose total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization offers a definite military advantage." So the first article here, Article 52.2, makes it very clear that if I want to make a decision on what I am allowed to target in international law, if I am a Russian commander who is targeting a city, for example, the specific target within the city that I am obligated under international law to follow are strictly military objectives. Simple as that. Article 48 of Additional Protocol 1 goes a little bit further and adds to this. It says, and I quote, "The parties to the conflict shall at all times distinguish between the civilian population and the combatants, and between the civilian objects and military objects." This is the principle of distinction. So not only am I only allowed to target military objects, I must be able to make a very clear distinction between a civilian object and a civilian person, and a military object and a military person. Simple as that. As we continue, Article 57.2a of the Additional Protocol 1 states that those planning an attack must, quote, "do everything feasible to verify that the objectives to be attacked are neither civilian nor civilian objects." So this ties into Article 48. We are making this distinction, and we have to do everything we can feasibly do to verify, to make sure that the objectives are not civilian objectives. Okay? It's as simple as that. So you might be asking, well, what makes you think that that Russia is allowed or should be able to or could just follow these rules? Because ultimately they might not even be a party to the additional Protocol 1. I'm actually sure if Russia is a party to the treaty on Additional Protocol 1. But ultimately, these rules on targeting and military decisions have been codified as customary rules of international law. Article 52.2 of the Additional Protocol 1, the one that talks about it has to be strictly military objectives, that is a customary rule. So it applies regardless of if involved has been part of the treaty. So ultimately, for the most part, in a lot of cases, in a lot of conflicts around the world, the targets are clearly military targets. And so therefore there's no questions that need to be asked. Okay, we see a military target very, very clearly. This is clearly a military target. If I was to destroy this military target, that would incur some military advantage to me, and it would offer a definite military advantage. Therefore, I could legally strike this military target. But in this conflict in particular, in this conflict where we are seeing attacks on cities and we are seeing civilians taking up arms against the Russian Federation, the military of the Russian Federation, it's a lot more difficult whether or not these are military targets versus non-military targets. It's very difficult to come to this and ascertain this question. It brings us to the issue of what we call dual-use targets. A dual-use target is a target that is both military and civilian. A target that can have a military function as well as a civilian function. So, for example, a media station or a bridge. A bridge is a very good example. A bridge will obviously give civilians some functionality. They'll be able to cross the bridge quite happily. And it will also give a military advantage if tanks can cross the bridge, for example. Now, the question is, what is the law as it relates to this? How does the law deal with this issue? What happens if we have a dual-purpose target? We have a bridge that could incur a military advantage, but the civilians use it. Well, according to Rogers, they say that it is difficult to neutralize the military effectiveness of those targets without simultaneously harming the civilian population. But what they do is they offer us a guideline, a general guideline that we could utilize as a way of trying to come to some kind of generalization of the rules related to dual-purpose targets. They say, and they reference a media station in their example, they say, quote, "Attacks on a media station may be permissible, subject to the rule of proportionality, if it helps the enemy in its military operations, for example, if it is integrated into the military communications system, but not if it merely broadcasts news." So, for example, if the bridge in question that we're talking about, that might incur a military advantage, if it does give a military advantage, clearly there are tanks driving across this bridge all the time, the enemy are, using this bridge here, there and everywhere, but it's also giving a civilian advantage as well. But proportionally it incurs a military advantage, okay, then that could possibly be legal under international law. If it's just simply a footbridge that no soldiers ever use, and it's just only used by civilians, then this would be a violation of international humanitarian law. That's what Rogers suggests in their determination on this case. So ultimately, the problem that we're going to be facing, if we're looking to the future, if we're looking into the end of this week and into next week, ultimately, this armed conflict for Putin is not going as well as he'd hoped. We've already seen and heard of reports that he's not very happy with the progress of this conflict, with the progress of Russian forces. And ultimately, as resistance manages to hold out, which it is doing in Ukraine, in cities like Kiev and Kharkiv, we might see more indiscriminate attacks, because out of desperation, because as Russia is subjected to further economic sanctions, as for example their currency begins to drop even more, as their stock exchange begins to drop even more, as their assets are frozen, and as the logistical failures of their invasion are further intensified and highlighted, we know it's very clearly that there have been logistical failures. This might lead to a certain amount of desperation, and that's what I believe is going to happen. So we've seen what I would argue is a bit more desperation in Putin's posturing of nuclear intensification by putting nuclear forces, I believe they were like nuclear security or something, on high alert. Now, this is ultimately just posturing, okay? And I believe that something similar to that will happen in terms of the invasion itself. If they continue to increase the intensity of the invasion and they create more intense bombardments of these cities that are holding out. Don't forget that they've not captured the capital city yet. It's been a week. They've not captured Kharkiv yet. They've been fighting in Kharkiv for almost the entire time. It's important to note that they might become more and more, the word, I wouldn't use this word, but I'm trying to think of another word. They might become more and more desperate in the case of trying to incur some kind of military advantage. And in doing so, that can lead to more war crimes. That can lead to the potential of indiscriminate attacks, indiscriminate bombings on civilian populations. And if this takes place, we're likely to see more and more war crimes being committed in this region. And ultimately, that's something that we're just going to have to sit back and watch at the moment for the time being. And we're going to have to ultimately, it's going to be a difficult situation for the entire of the international community. Ultimately, war crimes are generally a part of war. They happen every now and then in armed conflicts, but if they continue to increase in this particular armed conflict and we have more and more alleged cases of war crimes, then we could see some even more serious and grave violations of international humanitarian law. Now, I want to do some more podcasts on the Russia-Ukraine situation. Like I said earlier, I want to talk about the situation and how the law relates to the refugees. We don't just have to talk about law either in relation to this. I want to talk about the legal status of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine. Spoiler alert, they're not legally sovereign states. And I would also like to talk about some other issues that relate to this conflict, war crimes being committed in this conflict as well, but specifically what the International Criminal Court can do in this situation. We know from previous episodes that Ukraine has allowed the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court to take place within their state. So maybe we will start to see some intervention from the International Criminal Court. Ultimately, though, again, just like with all the other episodes we've talked about on this podcast, that it's something that we're going to follow the news on more and more. Things have seemed to slow down slightly in the last few days. Ultimately, maybe because of just the slowing down of the conflict itself. The Russian forces seem to have ground to a halt. I don't think this is going to be something that lasts long. I think this will get worse, and ultimately we're going to have to follow it, and we will follow it and give updates as we go along. But ultimately, the best advice would just be to follow the news, or ultimately, and come here for your legal analysis. So, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have any comments or questions, or leave them in the comments below. Any suggestions about future episodes would be really, really helpful. And this can be as interactive as you want. We'll do another community post as well to vote on potential future episodes. I thought that was very good. And I will see you in the next episode. We'll talk. Probably be talking about Russia Ukraine in the next episode as well, but if people don't want us to talk about that, then just let us know, and I hope everybody has a very nice evening.